Good morning. My name is Mark Silver. I'm doing a series of presentations on YouTube. These are all based on CLE programs that I've done in the United States for many years now. I've lectured to tens of thousands of lawyers. My two primary interests, doing forensic evaluations as a psychiatric social worker or for immigration lawyers and criminal lawyers. However, I've also done a number of cases for civil litigation lawyers, primarily in the area of personal injury, and that's what we're going to look at today. As I said, I'm a forensic psychiatric social worker with a doctorate in psychology. I'm also a lawyer. To the terrible embarrassment of my mother, I never practiced law. I have a background in family systems theory. I've been doing this since 2002. I've done thousands of cases, and I've written several books as well. Today's title is Psychosocial Evaluations and Consultation in Civil Litigation, Strategies to Understand and Humanize the Client. The main thing I want to get across is that psychosocial evaluations can be an indispensable tool in civil litigation, particularly in personal injury, medical malpractice cases, to evaluate the client. And I'm not simply referring to the obvious and immediate injury that the client suffered. However, looking more broadly at the client's quality of life and how that individual interacts with their family and community to really understand the full range of harms that the client has suffered as a result of the issue at hand. Ultimately, what we're trying to do, and this goes throughout all my programs, is to humanize the client. The underlying strategy is to distinguish this client from other clients who may have suffered similar injuries by providing detailed information about their psychosocial history so that whoever's reading the report or the forensic evaluation will understand the client in a more humane and humanistic level. And that includes the civil litigation lawyer himself or herself, so that you'll have the opportunity to understand your client better. After many moons and eons, I finally written this book called Psychosocial Evaluations. This psychosocial evaluation book is specifically geared to fill a hole that's been really at the center of many inquiries by civil litigation lawyers who I've talked to, and that is, they ask, I understand you're doing a psychosocial evaluation because you're a clinical expert, but the question is, what is entailed in the psychosocial evaluation? What are the categories of information? What am I trying to, or what are you trying to elicit? What are you trying to extract from the client during the interview that helps you provide a much broader range of understanding about the person's overall function in childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and so on. And that's what we're looking at today. I always try to integrate theory with practice. Integrating theory with practice, I think, is crucial for practicing lawyers. It's crucial for myself. Please don't hesitate to send me an email. My information will be in the YouTube description box, and I'll be happy to send you back a redacted sample of a evaluation in a personal injury case where we will actually integrate the slides from this PowerPoint, which I use for CLEs when I teach, into an actual case. Obviously, the information will be redacted so that the person's identifying information will be different, but I want something, and I always say this, I want something that lawyers can actually use. I really wanted this when I was in law school, and it's particularly important because we don't have this in law school. You know, you can get you're learning family law or you're doing tort law or whatever, or criminal law or mortgages, whatever it is in law school, and you think, well, a client's going to come to my office and I'm going to have to evaluate this client, and we don't have classes in law school to teach us how to evaluate clients, how to talk to clients, how to elicit information, how to direct clients towards a certain way so that not only their general concerns, but the specific concern related to the litigation or potential litigation can be understood not just objectively from a statutory point of view and supportive case law, but subjectively from the client's own experience. All the cases that I've done for civil litigation lawyer has been for consultation. I've done quite a few cases where I've actually interviewed clients and written up reports. I've even testified in a few cases, in fact. But I just want to say this is not for only plaintiffs in civil litigation matters, personal injury, med mal, and so on. This is also for defense lawyers. When I was in law school, I had several amazing internships, including for the Department of Justice in the Eastern District of New York. But I also had one for the New York Law Department in med mal defense, and I had another for plaintiffs in med mal for a major law firm in New York. And I just want to emphasize that this is really not just for plaintiffs' lawyers. To the contrary, I really want civil litigation defense lawyers to be able to extract very helpful ideas here so that they can understand themselves what the plaintiff's arguments are and how to tackle them, how to understand them, and how to strategically think about them. It is interesting to note, I have this in some of my lectures, that in 2012, the ABA, House of Delegates, adopted Resolution 107C, which formally urges criminal defense lawyers to address clients' civil legal and non-legal problems to linkages with other service providers. The report accompanying the resolution makes it clear that all defense lawyers are required to provide comprehensive representation, including using other social service providers like social workers when appropriate. Excuse me, and that's, something I really want to focus on today. Clearly, if your client was the victim of medical malpractice, you're obviously going to get a physician to evaluate the case and write an affidavit to say that it's a bona fide case to move forward with litigation. Similarly, I want lawyers to consider seriously, in maybe every case, hiring someone to do a psychosocial evaluation to consider not just that specific harm that the client may have suffered because of the med mal, as serious as it might be, but to consider a more holistic understanding about the client's losses and privations and limitations and traumas because of the harm that occurred. Obviously, this is true for individuals who've been the victims in a med mal case, a general personal injury case, but other kinds of cases as well. You may have been, for example, the victim of harm in the workplace because of sexual harassment or racism. The first thing I want to do then after this long introduction is to look at what is a psychosocial evaluation and what does it entail. First, it's not really a psychosocial evaluation, it's a biopsychosocial evaluation in the sense that you consider not just psychological social aspects of the person's background and history, but also biologic, physical, medical, anything within the broader healthcare scheme that impacts the client in their life in one manner or another. So a biopsychosocial evaluation is conducted to determine if there are any factors that would explain how the client has come to be in his current position, with particular consideration for several major categories. I'm going to go through them now. One is childhood experiences. That includes strengths, vulnerabilities, and also resilience that the client may have experienced in childhood. Quality of relationships to family members. It's sometimes called family dynamics, meaning was there love and support? Was there friction? What was the quality of relationships? Was there abuse? Was there neglect? Was there selflessness or tireless care provided by some maternal or paternal care figure, for example? Adult development. This looks at lifespan development. It was one time thought that infants developed and children developed a little bit and adolescents developed less and adults didn't really develop. This is completely untrue. Adults develop, adolescents develop, geriatrics develop. There's even developmental stages as we approach death. And it's important to understand that just about all the clients you're going to see, especially in medical malpractice, are adults, I suppose in personal injury as well. And just because they're adults, don't assume that they're not in possible stages of transition or development themselves, just like a child might be. The huge difference is that a child from age 7 to age 8, age 8 to age 9, 9 to 10, can develop substantially, especially through puberty and so on. It might not seem like an adult from age 30 to 35 or 35 to 40 is developing much, but don't discard that. The next major area of psychosocial evaluations is perception of self and other through experiences and interpersonal functioning, including our identity, self-esteem, self-concept, and so on. Another huge area is influences, environmental influences, religious, cultural influences. What forms our values? Another huge area is community interaction, our education, employment, socialization, and interests. Another area is medical and psychiatric issues. Again, we're looking at the person holistically from all perspectives, including medical health and mental health. Stressors, traumas, loss, shame, resentment, anger, guilt, jealousy, challenges, what kind of frustrations and disappointments, but also positive achievements this person has experienced from childhood through adolescence, adulthood, and so on. And lastly, what is the person's core needs? What are their hopes, dreams, and trust, and so on? There's a case I recently did, and I'll use it as an example to sort of flesh this out. This was an amazing case with an amazing lawyer in Kansas where, in Missouri, where the plaintiff sued a company because his wife was extremely seriously injured by tractor trailers and died soon later. This individual had an amazing marriage. They were lovebirds. They did everything together. They worked very far apart from one another, so they spoke on the phone constantly. It was just this amazing relationship. And yet, this is a man who grew up suffering systemic physical, emotional abuses, neglect, poverty, educational challenges. He was using drugs and had indiscriminate and unhealthy relationships before he met his wife. His siblings all went in very unhealthy directions. His siblings ended up with being alcoholics and drug abusers. They were in jail. They had very unhealthy relationships. And this client, whose wife tragically died in this accident, when he met her as a young adult, completely turned his life around. He gave up alcohol, he gave up drugs. He worked in the same job for 35 years that he didn't particularly love, but he did it because he loved his wife. They had 2 children, and overall the children turned out quite well. He had no bad habits. And when she was killed, the wife, in this tractor trailer accident, this horrible tragedy, he reacted not just through grief, but through profound loss, putting him back in a premarital state, returning him to alcohol and drugs and unsafe and unhealthy behaviors. He had to give up his home because it reminded him of his wife. He no longer had the same relationship with his grandchildren. He quit his job of 35 years, and his life was simply ruined. It's a great example of a case where someone, you would think at the heart of the case, has lost a loved one. He's lost his wife and his best friend, and that's obviously objectively true. But subjectively, you see the systemic harms that this person has suffered as a result of his wife's death. He couldn't go through a period of mourning or normal grief. Either he didn't have the capacity, or perhaps while she was alive she kept him stable and secure, but he lost that sense of stability through her death. And that's what we tried to show, that I tried to show through the psychosocial evaluation, tackling all these different areas of the person's early life and comparing and contrasting to what he had lost through this devastating tragedy. There are all sorts of issues you can ask with a psychosocial evaluation. I'm not going to go through them. I have them on PowerPoint slides that I'm looking at now and when I do formal CLEs. But you need to be a little bit sensitive to the person's background. And I'll just give you one or two huge examples. We're a country that unfortunately is almost always at war. So we have a lot of veterans. And it's important to ask if a person has served in the military, and if so, have they seen violence? Have they been the victim of violence? Have they seen others or have lost fellow soldiers in different ways? And if so, this could be a large area of inquiry. Obviously, if the person has never been in the military, it doesn't need to be asked about. Another huge area might be, education. Most of us finish high school. Some go on to college in the United States or graduate degrees. But, you may come across a client who has one of the extremes. For example, in this case, the client had only a high school education. But he had a very, very consistent career as a truck driver that was really important to him. It supported his self-esteem, and this was part of his identity, and so on. At the other end of the spectrum, you may have someone who's a highly educated person who has maybe a PhD, or they're a lawyer or a physician or engineer, and their years of investment in their educational programs for professional career reasons or for personal self-esteem may have been completely undermined through the personal injury. So you need to have sensitivity. You need to do a broad psychosocial evaluation with the criteria I had in the slide that I just mentioned previously, but also particular sensitivity to different areas of this person's life that may pertain to that person in particular. Before I look at the harm that the person has suffered in cases, I like to do this broad psychosocial history because I like to also get the person in a good place. In other words, have them often think about positive memories of childhood, family. I often say, what's your best memory growing up? I ask about hobbies, activities. Starting with the personal injury issue can be very difficult because the person is already undoubtedly very psychologically and emotionally preoccupied with this issue, and you need to have them feel sufficiently relaxed and develop trust with the individual through the evaluation that they're able to provide a wide range of information that they're comfortable with. Although not usually known very well, one of the areas that can be evaluated is something called psychodynamics, and I incorporated myself. Psychodynamics is the interrelationship of the unconscious and conscious mental and emotional forces that determine personality and motivation. Thinking about psychodynamics, we think about a person's sense of self, but also how they understand others, their self-esteem, self-concept, their sense of loyalty, trust. It can also include issues such as shame, humiliation, approval for oneself, but approval that a person may want to gain from another person, perhaps a parent or coworker. It's a very coping-focused idea. In other words, I often ask, you've had this horrible, overwhelming anxiety for many years. How have you managed to cope? How have you managed to get from point A to point B to point C, get to work every day, take care of the kids with such overwhelming personal challenges? So we want to know about their ego defenses. We want to know about their fears, anxieties, jealousies, their fantasies, frustrations, confusions, vulnerabilities, all sorts of hopes and ideals that the person may have had their strengths, their vulnerabilities. It just gives a much better sense of what has been lost through the personal injury, either their own personal injury or the personal injury suffered by a loved one, perhaps. I'll give you a very interesting example. I had a case where a man was helping customers at a kind of Costco, a large outlet, after they went shopping to put the bags in the car. And security thought this guy was harassing customers. He was really just helping and hoping for some small tips. And these horrible security people attacked the client and severely damaged his knees and his legs. It's just horrible. At any rate, when I did the evaluation, as this was actually a relatively new immigrant to the United States, he had 3 American children. He was in some ways doing very well. The kids were in school, cute kids, just progressing wonderfully. And, I was trying to focus on the injury to his legs and his knee, and he needed all sorts of surgeries. And he kept redirecting me toward the home. And I was wondering why. And he said, look, the worst part of these injuries is not the horrible pain and the surgery and the fact I'm never going to be able to walk like I did before. He said, the worst part is I'm debilitated at home. And I need my daughters to help me and my wife to help me in and out of the bathtub. I need them to help me sometimes even to get on and off the toilet. And he talked about not the personal pain from the injury, but the humiliation and the sense of shame that he had to contend with since the injuries to his self-esteem. And, he was a father that the girls looked up to, very loving. It's a very close family. And in many ways, he felt that was shattered. So the purpose of psychosocial evaluations is to have professional expression replace self-expression. Just like, you have a personal injury, you don't go to court yourself. You need an attorney because the law is counterintuitive. It's difficult to navigate the court system and so on, paperwork, documents, what to prepare. It's difficult to express your own personal psychological and emotional issues. So you go to a psychosocial evaluator who's an expert in forensics to have sensitivity to ask questions and elicit information through the psychosocial evaluation so that that information can be culled and ultimately memorialized through a report. It's not just a mental health report. I'm not just saying, and these reports are not just saying that this person suffered depression or anxiety because of some personal injury, but you're looking broadly at the person's life. This client whose wife was killed in the tractor trailer accident, it's not just that he's depressed and he was suicidal and that's horrible and he's getting help for that, but that his life was fundamentally turned upside down. So within the report I'm writing, I'm accessing and giving a nod to how it's affected his employment, his family, his community, and so on. There may be, and this is very, very important, biases and prejudices that the defense lawyer has. And I had this in this case. The defense lawyers kept saying, well, yes, he lost his wife, and that's terrible in this horrible tractor trailer accident, but isn't he experiencing grief? Isn't he experiencing something that is what we would call the normal mourning process over a period of weeks and even months? And that was a prejudice that the defense lawyers had that they couldn't get out of their heads. And they actually didn't focus on the most important things because they didn't have a consultation clearly with a psychosocial expert in this area. And because they couldn't because they couldn't get their minds away from that bias, when I wrote my report, they didn't really absorb the report or absorb, where holes in that report may exist. They just remained focused on their own bias and prejudice. We want to dispel non-existent patterns that the lawyer in the case may have. For example, I'm trying to think of something that's very pertinent here. Well, in this case where I saw the individual who, had his legs and knees severely damaged by the security officer as he was helping customers with their groceries and so on in the retail outlet, there was a sense that this person sort of asked for it. I hate to say it, but there was a sense that this person had for many months been working, frankly, illegally in these parking lots, assisting people, and that, well, because he's there day in and day out, and the security officer saw him day in and day out, there's some sense that he kind of deserved it. And the reality is, this was a client without any criminal history whatsoever. There were no complaints of harassment against him. There was no sense from anyone that he was involved in any wrongdoing other than trying to make a few dollars assisting customers coming out with their groceries. And it's important that the behaviors and patterns of behaviors are understood in a correct way. So the goal here is to create a written narrative, almost what you would see a videographer present, but with clinical understanding and clinical sensitivity. It's from a clinical perspective storytelling. The goal is to humanize the case. This is what I said at the outbook. My hope in all of these cases, immigration, criminal, personal injury, for any lawyer, even when I do consultation, is to humanize the case through a sympathetic narrative understanding of the harms that the client has suffered, informed by the psychosocial history. We want to get the sense of security, safety, stability that the client has lost as a result of the harm or injury. We want to maximize advocacy and, frankly, maximize just compensation if possible. Again, this is not just for plaintiff's lawyer. This is for defense lawyers so that they can understand the harm in both a very narrow and broad manner, so that they could have a similar set of strategic tools to consider the presentation of the client and what can be countered. My own personal opinion is that only forensic experts should evaluate these cases, those who have the ability to undertake a broad psychosocial evaluation. Psychological evaluations themselves are sometimes a bit too narrow. General mental health practitioners may not have the sensitivity or training. If the person has a therapist prior to the personal injury, the thing is that the psychotherapist will probably not have training or understanding about this. They may not want their notes to be revealed. They may not want to do a psychosocial evaluation on the injury. They may not want to be called for a deposition or for trial. The evaluation, and this is something to understand also, it's not a general evaluation, as I said before, the forensic psychosocial evaluation in the personal injury case. It's very broad in one sense, but it's also very targeted in another sense. And that's something that needs to be balanced and can only be balanced by a professional who's done many of these evaluations. It's important for the client not to over-exaggerate narratives in an effort to bolster a weak claim, and not under-exaggerate a narrative because he fears that the truth is simply too terrible to relate to another person, or too sad or traumatic to be believed. And the truth is, correcting one or both will make the narrative clearer, particularly as extraneous material tends to denigrate the underlying narrative of the petitioner's claim. There's certain memories that tend to be very detailed and difficult to forget. One is something that is outrageous, and in other words, an occurrence that is quite exceptionally out of the ordinary. Another memory are qualified memories. That is, memories of something that may seem similar to something else, but is qualified by a context. And I'll give you a perfect example. I see a lot of domestic violence cases, and I'll see a woman who's been, for example, the victim of verbal abuse countless times in the home. She's degraded. The abuser uses all sorts of expletives towards her, and she feels terrible about herself. But all these examples of verbal abuse sort of get squashed into one or two memories because she can't keep track of them. One day she's out with her husband who abuses her, and her family's there, her parents, her brother, sister, for her birthday or whatever. And the abusive husband says something that is verbally abusive. Oh, you're stupid. Why do you even have birthdays? You're so useless. No one loves you. That memory won't be forgotten because it's qualified by a specific context where that person feels terrible because the verbal abuse that she suffered for months or years was quiet. It was in the home. No one knew about it. But here it's out in the open, and she feels a great sense of shame, maybe even guilt for one reason or another. That won't be easy to forget. Another area that's impossible to forget are things that are impossible to forget objectively. And that is, for example, someone who retains a scar through violence or through personal injury or whatnot. Every time you look at the scar, it triggers a memory of the context of when it occurs, and it's impossible to forget it. The next broad area I want to talk about in this program is actually how to conceptualize harms, because that's the core of everything, I think. What I'd say is conceptualize harms broadly. You know, the way I got into this, I was doing evaluations for an immigration lawyer I knew, but this lawyer also did other kinds of work, including civil litigation. And he referred me one or two cases to evaluate harms the client had suffered, and I said, you know, it's not really my background. He says, you know, you do immigration evaluations where persons suffer harm because of separation from family members. They've suffered harm because they've been persecuted because of their religion. You do evaluations for harm because they've been the victim of a crime. And he gave other examples. He says it's the same thing. And so I started to do these cases. And it's true. You want to look at harm broadly. Harm to self, dignity, identity, self-worth, the quality of life issue harms, the sense of security, safety, stability that's been undermined through this harm, deficits and losses in everyday activities such as work, loss of hobbies, activities, interests, harms in the area of cognitive loss, the ability to have memories and process information, ADLs, activities of daily living, crucial to personal dignity. You know, to what degree is the person able to toilet himself? To what degree is the person able to get in and out of a shower to clean himself? Interpersonal friction that now arises because of the injury, marital friction, family, workplace friction, socialization issues, lifestyle changes. The little things matter. Those little things that keep us going in life may not seem very important, but when they're suddenly unavailable or too difficult to tackle because of an injury, they become very, very important. Looking broadly at the person's community loss, isolation, privations, withholdings, even change of residence. Look at harm broadly. If you want to humanize the case, look at the person's everyday life, their everyday functioning, not just the huge things, but the small things that they really love, and make them who they are. In other words, those things that make them individuals. Types of harms. I talk about this at length in other CLEs and lectures where I have harm issues. But first, obviously, physical harm. Direct physical harm of various kinds. That could be hitting, sequestering, also physical harm through objects. This is very important in abuse allegations, particularly in the workplace, whether it's physical or sexual or both. You want to get a good sense of the different kinds of harms, physical harms that can occur, and some of them can be quite difficult to ask about. And I'll give you a very obvious example. Menacing and intimidation, physical intimidation in the home or workplace. I've seen many cases, especially of domestic violence, because it's one of my specialties, where actually you see no physical harm by the abuser, but the abuser moves around in the home because they have such unstable moods and erratic behaviors that the victim is always frightened because the person has a menacing physical presentation, so they're physically intimidating. Another major type of harm is psychological, which often refers to control, coercion, mental harm. Another type of harm, which is a cousin to psychological, is emotional harm, which concerns itself more with feelings and reactions. There's verbal harm, which could include racial slurs, threats, expletives, and so on. It could even include, for example, what's it called? Oh my Lord, I'm blanking. When you threaten someone based on harm. Sexual harms, similar to physical, they can be unwanted sexual touching of any kind. In some cases, in domestic cases, it can be even withholding. It can include a partner cheating, all sorts of things that you may want to consider. Oh, the word, of course. Extortion. I see this a lot in immigration cases where an abusive spouse extorts money by saying, if you don't give me $500, I'm going to call immigration services to have you deported. That is a verbal extortion that leads to financial harm. Financial harm itself is very important. Financial loss, direct and indirect. This is often an issue in personal injury cases. Privations, withholding, neglect. I do a lot of cases where I see children who have grown up and I ask them about the abuses they suffered in childhood, what they talk about openly. But one of the things they'll talk about is neglect. And the worst kind of neglect they'll tell me is, my dad would say he would come to picking me up 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. My parents had been separated for years. And I'd sit down, wait for my dad at 4 o'clock after school, 4:15, 4:30, 5 o'clock, 5:30, he didn't come. This happened week after week, year after year. And I felt so foolish. My dad always said he would come, he would never come. That's not abuse, specifically. It's neglect. And neglect should be considered as much in harm evaluations, if appropriate for your kind of case. There are other kinds of harms also. Religious, cultural harm. I see this a lot in domestic abuse cases, where, for example, someone may be not permitted to attend church. And technology harms, which is huge now, where, for example, an abuser or someone who's harmed another may control the person's social media account, passwords, and so on. It's very useful to look at the client's functioning before and after the harm, before and after the injury, as a means to gain insight into the client's daily life. In general, mental health is often conceptualized as healthy functioning, and demonstrating how the client's functioning is markedly different from others in his community through restrictions or self-imposed prohibitions, because the harm can be very powerful. Another major consideration after functioning is actually why the harm occurred. Now, at one extreme, you can find obvious patterns, especially in domestic violence where the abuser uses alcohol. So, for example, the person does not use alcohol all week because the abuser goes to work and goes to work faithfully every day, gets his check on a Friday, cashes it, goes out drinking Friday night, comes home, and he's physically, emotionally, sexually abusive to his partner. May happen Saturday night again. Sunday, the person's trying to recover, working off a hangover, may even have withdrawal symptoms, and prepares, maybe through even exercise and better eating habits, for work on Monday. And again, Monday to Friday, there's no abuse. Friday, again, after work, he cashes his check, goes drinking, the cycle begins again. That's a distinct pattern. However, in many cases of harm, there is no distinct pattern. At one very obvious end of the spectrum is arbitrary. You walk out from the street, from the sidewalk onto the street, you're a pedestrian, you have the green light, and a car hits you and you're injured. The driver of the car, he may be an idiot, but he has no animus towards you. I mean, it was just an arbitrary, horrible thing that happened. And that's an important thing to distinguish. A defendant may act without reason. Sometimes there is reason. Sometimes there's blind hatred. There could be psychopathy involved. I'll tell you something very interesting. The absence of patterns can actually lead to greater psychological harm. So, for example, if you're the victim of domestic violence in a home, or the victim of sexual harassment in the workplace, if you have predictability about when you're going to be sexually harassed because the abuser has a particular pattern, you actually have less psychological harm. When there's no predictability, when you cannot form any certainty about your life and what's going to happen to you about the harm, then it actually causes significantly more anxiety and, as a result, often more mental health issues. And as a result, you take your plaintiff as you find him. And the psychosocial evaluation is a good tool to show how you find that individual. You want to find and discuss what ways the harm has been exacerbated or informed by the client's previous issues. You want to know if there's a predisposition to mental health issues due to past trauma, perceived or real. That's very, very important. It's not just objectively if this person has suffered harm in the past, but what the person's subjective perceptual experiences were. And you know, just one example, you have kids, they grow up in a home where objectively it seemed safe and healthy, and the other siblings say, yeah, things were safe and healthy, and the parents say, yeah, safe and healthy. And this kid who grows up, or maybe as an adolescent, the kid says, I had a horrible childhood. I know I had a horrible childhood. My parents were terrible to me. Things were terrible. It's important to understand both the objective reality as presented by others who can provide a parallel history, but also the subjective experience of your client. The eggshell rule really also makes you think about in what ways is this particular person vulnerable? What are his vulnerabilities? In what way is he or she fragile because of past experiences? Sometimes there are unrecognized harms. The client may have suffered various harms as a result of an injury that he's not even aware of, and that's another great reason to get a psychosocial evaluation. It's similar to, personal injuries after a car accident. I ride my bike to and from work every day, and unfortunately I get into an accident about every year and a half. Thankfully, they're not so bad. I got into a really bad accident about 5 weeks ago, and I hit my head. Thank God I was wearing my helmet, and I was really saved. But I've had a number of injuries where I get up and I really feel fine. But it turns out later that I was not fine. And just like in personal injury, car accidents, whatever, you always want your clients to get radiographic assessments, whatever it is, MRIs or X-rays or CAT scans to really look inside, because you don't make assumptions about the person's well-being by just looking at the person's body when they've been in a serious accident. Similarly, don't make assumptions about the person's psychological and emotional health simply because after being in a situation they say, yeah, I generally feel okay. I'm going to work. I have a few friends. I hang out with them. I'm watching the same TV shows. Are they okay? Are you going to trust their own assessment of themselves? Are they clinicians? Do they know what questions to ask themselves? So that's very, very important. I also just want to stress that the relationship, and I touched on this before, between the defendant and the plaintiff can be very, very important. And I'll give you an example maybe too. Someone works at a place where they suffer sexual harassment. They've been there a few months and they report it, and there's a sexual harassment claim that goes forward. In the next case, you see someone has been at the same workplace for 10 years and they suffer sexual harassment. But that person feels that their coworkers and their boss, that they're a family, that they have very good relationships that they've developed over the years. And for them, the sexual harassment they suffer by the boss isn't only wrong because it hurts them physically or psychologically and so on, but there's a sense of betrayal of trust that the victim suffers in that second case where they've been in the place for 10 years, they feel they're really a family, that may not exist in the first case. So how the client understands or perceives his relationship and connection to the defendant can be very important. We learn in law school, of course, about a cause and fact, which is determined by the but-for test, and, of course, proximate cause, which is sets a legal limitation of cause and fact. Proximate cause is really an event sufficiently related to a legally recognizable injury to be held to be the cause of that injury. We learn about foreseeability, which determines if the harm resulting from an action could reasonably have been predicted. Something may look attenuated, but it may in fact be directly related. These issues can actually be fleshed out potentially through a good forensic psychosocial evaluation. It may give you a better sense, even though you know specifically what the personal injury is, for example, very, very well as the lawyer. It may give you a better sense of the person's life before and after and how they're functioning to actually directly address these specific legal issues. One of the questions that emerges then, is it better or worse to wait for an evaluation? So, my feeling is, what they say in Chicago about voting, vote early, vote often. Get an evaluation as soon as possible because you want to know the client's reaction and functioning as soon after the event occurs. It doesn't mean you can't have follow-up. I saw this client whose wife was killed in the tractor-trailer accident. He had this horrible childhood with every possible harm you can imagine, and his life turned into roses through this amazing marriage to his wife, and then his life fell apart again after her horrible death. He was not evaluated by me immediately after the accident, but he was in a psychiatric ward because he was suicidal, so they had an evaluation on him. I saw him several months later. And just before the civil litigation trial, the lawyer asked me to see him again. So what was great was, I was able, before I even saw him, to read the psych reports from the hospital to get a sense of his functioning earlier. Then I saw him several months later, and then I saw him right before the trial again. And it gave me a sense of not only his functioning right after, but it showed how the harm, psychological, emotional harm that he suffered and how his life had been turned upside down remained very consistent. In other words, he never really, after a year and a half or whatever it was, went back, or 2 years, 3 years, went back to his job. He never went back to live in his home. He never really reconnected with his children or grandchildren. So you want to get an evaluation early, but it's also good to maintain checkups. You also could look at harm to family members, direct or indirect, how it affects children's functioning, school, socialization. Parallel histories are extremely helpful. They're extremely helpful because the things that your wife will tell you about you, the things that your partner or your husband will tell you about you, as loving as the relationship is and as caring, will provide insights into a third party that can be invaluable. You want to come off as strong. You want to come off as secure or stable. There are things you don't want to talk about because they're embarrassing. You have your wife, you have your spouse, family member there who can provide a parallel history. It's invaluable to me. There's some caveats I just want to note before we look at some psychiatric issues. The first is that the severity of a single incident can be systemically damaging. And that means that, you can have a car accident, and most people walk away from car accidents without PTSD, as you can probably imagine. But it doesn't mean that you should discard the possibility just because it's a single event that there isn't profound systemic harms that the person has in fact suffered. And I saw a case where someone was in a car accident. It wasn't the worst car accident in the world, but because of her previous issues, it was horrible. This was a woman who suffered abuses earlier on, and she dealt with her life problems by turning to alcohol and drugs. And because of the car accident, she was prescribed analgesics, painkillers that got her back onto using drugs. So that single incident of harm was systemically damaging given her life history. Next, microaggressions can add up to systemically damaging harm. In other words, someone in the workplace who's describing harassment, it may not seem particularly important to you as you're assessing the case, but you have to look subjectively at how these incidents day in and day out, week in, month in, month out, maybe even year in and year out, can add up to systemically damaging harm. Also, as I mentioned several times, people perceive and are affected by harm in idiosyncratic ways. And people have idiosyncratic resilience. And it's very important because you may see someone who suffered what seems like serious harm, but they seem okay. In a sense, you should believe them, but in a sense, don't believe them. In a sense, you may want to say, maybe I should get this person assessed to have a psychosocial evaluation to see to what degree they really are resilient, to what degree they're really functioning as they should, or maybe their lives have been changed. Don't forget the possibility of intergenerational trauma that may have occurred and how that may affect the client today, cumulative effects of harm, and also try to distinguish between single incidents, as I mentioned just a moment ago, versus sustained incidences of harm. A very typical example of a sustained incident is sustained abuse, childhood abuse, but also spousal abuse, where there is consistent physical, emotional, psychological, sexual, and other kinds of financial, whatever abuses over many months, over many years. What's important in that sustained, repeated harm, you often get clients who experience complex trauma. And I have a completely separate program in CLE that I have uploaded to YouTube. The complex trauma program is targeted actually towards criminal lawyers whose clients have suffered complex trauma in earlier years. But I really encourage civil litigation lawyers to look at the complex trauma YouTube video, because it'll give you understanding about clients who've suffered not just a single incident of harm, but repeated harm over many years. And that could be your clients who've suffered harassment from a domestic partner, abuses in the workplace, and many other possibilities. In the time we have left, I just want to go over some of the major mental health issues. First, and most importantly, obviously, is PTSD, and that occurs when a person is exposed or they have the subjective fear of something terrible happening, such as death or threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, sexual violence. Again, it's important to look at both the objective circumstances, but also at the subjective experience and perception of the client. Such clients often have intrusive symptoms such as intrusive thoughts and memories and so on. They may have dissociation. They may have physiologic reactivity, which can be very similar to panic attacks. They may have avoidance. They may not want to have any contact with people, events, places, or even conversations that remind them of the harm that they've suffered. Many of these clients have negative alterations in cognition and mood, leading to anxiety, depression. They may have difficulty remembering key issues of the harm itself. They may have persistent negative beliefs about themselves or even adopt self-blame. There are alterations in arousal and reactivity, where clients may feel quite irritable, aggressive. They may engage in reckless or self-destructive behavior. Many can be quite guarded, hypervigilant, and they may have all sorts of problems with sleep, appetite, concentration, and so on. Again, try to consider if it's a PTSD case or complex trauma case or both. Again, complex trauma is not from a single incident, but repeated incidences of harm. Many of our clients suffer from depression, where there's a depressed mood. Often nearly every day is indicated by subjective feelings of sadness and emptiness and crying, hopelessness, helplessness, low energy, anhedonia, psychomotor retardation or agitation, fatigue, loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness, excessive or inappropriate guilt, some of which may be delusional, poor or erratic appetite, poor or erratic sleeping patterns, nightmares, diminished ability to think or concentrate. All of these are important considerations. Another huge area is suicidality, which I have to say is quite often not asked about. Active suicidality means that the person has an active plan to end their life, for example, by ingesting pills or jumping off a bridge. But you also have passive suicidality, where the person has overwhelming feelings of despair and deep psychological pain, and they want to end their life, but they don't have a specific plan. They may think generally, gee, what would it be like if I could just sleep and sleep and sleep and never wake up so my psychological pain would vanish. Some of this may involve self-hatred, blame. They may feel useless. They may feel they're a burden to their family. They may lack a reciprocal connection to anybody. Some people may have chronic, habituated pain, and pain leads to feelings of hopelessness and helplessness as well, and despair, and that is a close cousin of suicidal ideation, and it should not be neglected. I mentioned panic attacks. Many clients have recurring and unexpected panic attacks. It's really characterized by heart palpitations, heart beating, sweating, trembling, shaking, sensation that you can't breathe, feelings of choking, nausea, abdominal problems, dizziness, lightheadedness, feeling you're going crazy, that you're going to lose control. There may be numbness. You may even have chills or hot flashes. What do these symptoms all have in common? They're all physiologically based, right? I mean, so much of what we talk about is psychological, emotional. Here's something that's very physiologically based, and you have a personal injury case. And that dovetails to a much larger consideration if there are no obvious medical or physical issues for the client, such as in a sexual harassment case, to in fact consider through panic attacks medical, physical consequences. There may be somatization, where there's chronic psychological issues that cause bodily symptoms, including pain. The symptoms can't be traced to any physical cause, and they are not the result of substance abuse or another mental illness. This is typified by having one or more physical symptoms that are distressing or cause disruption in daily life. They can be excessive, and there may be thoughts, feelings, or behaviors related to the physical symptoms. There is often ongoing considerable anxiety related to the bodily preoccupations. These people are not faking symptoms. People have somatoform disorder are not feigning. These are real disorders. If there is a functional problem, such as the person can't move their arm or their neck is like this and there's no medical physical explanation, then we refer to it as a conversion disorder, where there's neuromuscular or neurological change of that kind. Some clients engage in self-blame because of the injury. This client I had who was horribly harmed on his knee and leg, helping shoppers coming out of the shopping area. He blamed himself for not having a different kind of a job. He blamed himself for helping the customers with their bags when technically he was not supposed to be working in the parking lot. He didn't kill anybody. He's just helping people with bags. But nonetheless, he took responsibility for his actions. Another thing very often not asked about, just like suicidality, another huge area that's ignored by lawyers is psychosis. You'll see your client and you ask questions and things seem okay. The client's answering in a coherent way. They seem to be with it. don't discard the possibility of this psychosis. Psychosis basically means out of touch with reality. It's quite complicated, actually, but the two main kinds are hallucinations, which are false perceptions, and the other is delusions, which are false beliefs. And you'll sometimes get clients, and they may not talk about it openly, so you have to ask about it, and they may have suffered a serious personal injury of one kind or another, and they're, I say, when you walk down the street and nobody is there, do you sometimes hear your name being called and you turn around and still nobody's there? And they'll say yes. Well, that's an auditory hallucination. Another common kind are nighttime visual hallucinations because the person, for some reason, just doesn't feel safe. Delusions, which are false beliefs, are also not uncommon, where the person may feel very guarded and suspicious, and they may gain a low sense of trust in others because they have adaptive paranoia. I used to see this a lot with clients who were in prison, clients who would go in and they would always be looking over their shoulder for safety reasons, which makes sense, but they come out of prison and they're the same way. And for months and even years afterwards, they're very guarded about who they will associate with. So don't discount the possibility of things that may not seem obvious, including suicidality, psychosis, and so on. Some clients may have a dissociative disorder. When flight and fight responses are not available, then the only option is to psychologically, emotionally remove yourself from that situation and place yourself somewhere else. That's dissociative. Dissociative conditions that involve disruptions or breakdowns of memory, awareness, identity, or perception. People with dissociative disorders use dissociation as a defense mechanism, pathologically and involuntarily. Another huge area related to this is fawning and freezing, right? If you have fight and flight, but there's also fawning and freezing. Where you have a threat, you fawn, you try to placate the threat, right? The bear in the woods, you can't fight the bear. You can't run away from the bear. It's going to run after you. So you placate the woods. You do something against the threat to try to calm it so it doesn't feel more intimidated or get more agitated. The other is freezing, where literally there's a threat, a bear in the woods or, an abusive spouse, whatever it is, and you freeze. Or you're in the workplace and there's a person who's sexually harassing you. What do you do in order to obtain a kind of protective shell? You freeze every time you have a sense that the person is nearby. Many clients who suffered harms have also either reverted back to or begin for the first time the use of drugs or alcohol, some of which may be quite addictive. And it's important to note that the person may be self-medicating and using drugs or alcohol because of their need to contend with their personal injury issue. There's something called factitious disorder. It's a condition in which a person acts as if he or she has an illness by deliberately producing, feigning, or exaggerating symptoms for psychological or emotional gain. You should be aware of that. This is not malingering. I'm on the listserv for National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and a defense lawyer sent in to the listserv a question about, he was inquiring about malingering as a diagnosis. Malingering is not a diagnosis. Factitious is a diagnosis, is a disorder. Malingering is something that happens when you make up an illness or an injury or symptoms so that you get pecuniary gain. With malingering, you're after monetary support or something else. With factitious disorder, you want psychological or emotional support. There are also subclinical issues. Don't forget that not everybody presents with depression or anxiety in the same way. You may have people that have never been diagnosed and they may be ashamed, or they may not want to see a mental health practitioner. It may be the first time they've discussed these things. Please have cultural sensitivity. You may have clients that actually have suffered depression or anxiety, but they've gone to church and they've spoken to fellow parishioners or their pastor, and that served as counseling for them. For some clients, psychiatric care is anathema to their cultural background, and mental health diagnoses are stigmatized. Thank you very much for listening today. What I've tried to do is provide a broad outline about how psychosocial evaluations by a forensic expert can substantially assist you as an attorney to help understand your plaintiff, to understand who they are, to humanize their case based on their psychosocial background, but also defense lawyers to understand holes in the case, how to tackle it strategically, and so on. The ultimate goal is to humanize the case, to replace their own thoughts and feelings professionally so that the lawyer can advocate in a more complete way. You're welcome to buy my book. I promise it's bloody cheap. If you want to, don't hesitate to email me if you want a redacted sample of a personal injury case. Put your full signature. When you send the email, first of all, put the word CLE or program YouTube from, whatever, so I know it's not spam. And please put your full name, address, and everything. I will not send you back spam, I promise, but I want to make sure you're a real lawyer, an attorney that I can feel comfortable sending information to through an attached document. I hope this was helpful today. I wish these kinds of programs were available when I was in law school, but as a psychiatric social worker, I hope that these are beneficial. If you wish me to present a CLE to your local chapter for civil litigation, or for your state or whoever, or for an organization that you're attached with, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'd love to do it. I've done dozens and dozens of CLEs over the years, and I'm sure it'll be helpful for your colleagues as well. Thank you very much, and I'll see you at the next YouTube presentation.